Hey everybody, it's Scoots, and I just wanted to thank everybody for all their comments on the last post. Um, it's tough to say. Uh, Shoot, I thought I had the last post pulled up with the poll. Um, how powerful the feedback was because this is just another piece of information I never totally had in 10 years of making the show. Um, and then I've always been confused about it. I guess it's like just having these more open form discussions and thinking about the change in the future of the show really is unlocking a lot of stuff. And this is just another example of, I mean, yeah, I guess if you haven't watched that first video, you should watch that first of like kind of getting an understanding of how people meeting people where they are that support the show or meeting people where they are that don't support the show but listen to the show. And man, this feedback, it's just I mean, I'm glad I accidentally framed the questions the way I did, or the poll, because it was an accident almost, and it resulted in the best feedback possible, which is like the idea that the show's a big part of my life. So it's more than a service to me, but I don't necessarily like, I would rather be a passive member of the community. I want to actively support the podcast that puts me to sleep. Maybe it's from bonus content, or maybe it's just because you realize like the value you get out of Sleep With Me, and that it takes a ton, like that it has that supporting it is a important thing. But the idea that like most people, it seems like, would prefer that. And then there's people that are super active, like in that want to be an active member of the community, but that those two things are not the same. Like the value of the podcast and your participation in the community are two separate things. I think for some confused reason, I might have had that mixed up and not realized that those were two separate things. And that there's people that obviously on that post intensely value the podcast, not just in supporting it, but even commenting with your comments. Those are two huge things that almost, when you look at the world of the podcast, the consumption of the show, most people don't do either one of those. But especially people that said, hey, I don't normally comment because I'm a lurker or whatever, which I could relate to, right? I'm not a big active member of communities either. And I prefer to lay low, like, or participate, but not in a front facing way. So, man, thank you so much, everybody that commented or gave feedback. And it really helps my understanding. And yeah, the verbiage of the questions wasn't perfect, but I think it really is like thinking about that, like with the public show and getting more people to support the show, that most people, and this is a conversation I've had unrelated to Sleep With Me listeners, that Sleep With Me is more used as a service than as a podcast. But it's delivered in podcast form, and most people consume the podcast in its free form, ad supported form, linearly, like these conversations we've been having on these videos. And but how do we keep that going? like how do you like, that's always been the question. And it's like, okay, well, and what we've learned from Patreon and doing that for a while is like, okay, like it's not quite enough, and there's a couple hurdles, and there is a way that the Patreon and people that use playlists, and from Charlotte tagging a lot of episodes, it's like we've got this idea that, yeah, like this is for people that do view Sleep With Me as a service. Like paying for a free podcast is like, one, because it is a part of my life, because it is an essential part of my life, or a pretty important part of my life, putting me to sleep or keeping me company. But also, yeah, like if there's an option to use this as a service where I'm just getting the story only episodes, or I just have I mean, not just, but like I have a feed that just has story only episodes, or I have a feed that just has regular episodes without the ads, or I have access to a feed that has story or all intro episodes and all night episodes, or a feed that just has bonus episodes. I don't know. I'm kind of stunned, like in a good way. I can't believe this feedback, and like I'm just tickled pink because it's like, man, I didn't realize like how I was like, huh, why is there like, I mean, because I see the stats right on Patreon of like the consumption of the episodes, right? And so I know like, hey, like only about, I can't remember the statistics anymore. I can't pull them up right now, but like of how many people like listen to the bonus content, but then how many people are on our Discord, and then how many people watch a video like this, and those numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller. But that doesn't have to do with how much people value the show or want to be a part of it, but part of it like by like taking action to support the show. But yeah, that's where I'd prefer, and watching these videos or whatever and listening to the show, like, and supporting the podcast is where I would like to participate. Doesn't change how valuable the show is to you. And I didn't mean to project it in that way. It was just, I mean, I don't think anybody took it that way either. Like it's just amazing to kind of parse this stuff out. Like making the show for 10 years. I mean, because to be honest, like in a lot of these videos, the majority of feedback I get is two types of feedback. The majority I get, there's specific questions, but usually I didn't get those until we really have kept at these question corner things. But the majority of feedback I get, I mean, not all of it, but the majority is two things. One, people just tell me their story. And that's happened throughout the history of the show. Hey, this is what my sleep's like. Found the podcast, and this is what it does for me, or this is how it's impacted me positively. That's one type of feedback, and sometimes that has like a little bit of other constructive feedback in there, or it just helps me because it's like, hey, this is how I consume the show. Then there's like other feedback. Like there is like, but it's usually easier. That's the kind of constructive feedback it gets. It's like, hey, I consume the podcast in this way, or this is my experience. And then there's people that like are experiencing a form of outrage, like either they're short-term listeners or long-term listeners, or they say they're long-term listeners of the show. And that's usually like about whether the show needs support or whatever it is. And I mean, I don't want to get into the demographics of the show, but taking the time to get this feedback and then the feedback from the free listeners kind of change that. It's like, oh, just because the majority of feedback I get of this non-positive feedback or non-story sharing feedback, it's not representative, right, of how most people experience the podcast. And this is just another reveal of that to me after making this show for 10 years, that it's like, oh, this is another reveal. Like, so reveal one was like, most people prefer to linearly consume an ad-supported show, and they get a ton of value out of it. And they prefer to do that in a passive way, fully passive way. Like either to them, Sleep With Me is a service provided by the sponsors, which is a wrinkle with direct response sponsors, or Sleep With Me is just a sleep podcast. And if it's not Sleep With Me, it's going to be something else. And those are valid ways to listen to the show. But like within that spectrum is like this huge spectrum of like how important it is to those people that prefer to listen or by necessity listen to the ad-supported feed, but they prefer to listen linearly. And now there's this other layer of reveal of like, hey, I highly, highly value the show, but but I don't want to be an active member of a community. I mean, that's like kind of a summary, right? Like it's not exactly what everybody said. Or I prefer to be a passive member. I'd prefer to actively support the show financially and with my enthusiasm, but in a quiet way. And that is not an indicator of my how much I value the podcast. It's just an indicator of my preference. Because most people that vocally express a preference, positive or negative, but they're very vocal, right? So it's a lot of times that these quiet voices get lost, and it's taken 10 years, really. I mean, I'm sure like to really get like a definitive amount of feedback like this on this post is a definitive amount of feedback. And the people that listen to the free podcast that can't afford to support the show, but they value it and they listen to it linearly, I got a definitive amount of feedback of people that said, "Oh, no, like I listen to the ad-supported show and I count on it, and I hope you can keep putting out a free ad-supported show because that's the way I listen." And we're offering some ways, hopefully in the future, for people if they can't afford to support the show, but they want an ad-free experience. There'll be ways to do that. But yeah, these two pieces of feedback, they're just stunning. I don't know how it's put. I mean, I'm sure it might not seem stunning in a positive way, but it is. It's like a new dawning. Again, just because sometimes the loudest people get the most attention, and that's not necessarily fair. And it's not just that the loudest people or the most intense people trigger the most intense feelings in me too. And that can be hard to see clearly after that happens. And I mean, I think I've done enough self-care and work, like I've talked about in other videos. It's like, those two things are also separate. People's positive impact does not inoculate me from how it feels when there's really intense other side feedback, and it doesn't inoculate me, or it doesn't counterbalance it. Just the impact of that has its own impact, and the impact of the positive stories is actually much more richer, because it's like I hear people's stories most of the time. There's like, hey, this is just how I experienced. This is how I found the podcast. This is what my life was like before it. This is what, and those can be people that listen temporarily, like students that were preparing for exams, or people that listen ongoing. And again, just hearing this experience of people like, hey, this is how I experience as a long-term supporter of the show or a new supporter of the show. And I would prefer, my preference is that I'm good with how I experience things currently. So anyway, thanks everybody for taking the time, and I really appreciate it. And this may have been confusing, and I may be still confused. So let's keep this ongoing conversation going. Thanks, everybody.